Welcome back to part 3 of analysing Jim Lee's X-Men, where I will try and pick apart and analyse his work so that us mere mortals can use those tips and tricks for our own artwork. Today, we'll be learning how to draw hair the Jim Lee way. Throughout this video, I'll be trying to use the same terminology throughout, and each section builds on the other, so I wouldn't recommend that you skip forward, unless, of course, you're a rebel. Enough intro. On with the learning. Step 1. Shape and form. So step 1 is to create a very loose shape to the hair, and inside that we can use depth and layers to create form. The bigger the hair, the looser the shape is one of the rules we'll be going by today. What I mean by this is if we were to squint or turn the hair into a silhouette, we wouldn't see the details, we'd simply just see the basic shape. To show you what I mean, I've organised these characters in terms of tight shapes to loose shapes. We'll go through each one and I will explain how to create the hair form inside each of the hair shapes. If we look at Colossus, he has a very obvious shape to his hair. You can clearly see the planes that create the shape. Unfortunately for Colossus, his hair is basically the end of a cylinder. So for today, he is the outlier. Sorry Colossus. Today is not your time to shine. Next up on our graph is Wolverine and Beast. Both have a fairly tight shape and they have very clear directional form. And what I mean by that is that we can see both the direction and defined chunks or layers of hair. Surprisingly, Cyclops and Gambit must go to the same barber, because in terms of shape and construction, both have very similar hair. The only difference being is that Gambit has much more volume to his hair. Things do get a lot more complicated though when we talk about long hair, wavy hair, and curly hair. So, let's dive in. Jean and Psylocke have lightly wavy hair, which in terms of long hairstyles is one of the easiest to draw. As we can see here, Jim creates volume in Jean's hair by adding small curves to emphasise her hair lifting from her scalp. Rather than drawing lots of lines of detail, he keeps it minimal, and when he draws both Psylocke and Jean, he creates form by adding layers. These layers are created by overlapping sets of wavy hair clumps to create the illusion of depth. Storm is sort of the medium difficulty hair. She has long hair, but is both voluminous and virgin on curly, with lots of use of layers. So if we use what we've learned so far for Storm and apply large directional form clumps with keeping in mind to overlap and underlap these clumps, then we're off to a solid start. Before I talk about Rogue and Magneto, I'd like to talk about our sponsor. I joke, there is no sponsor for today. I am way too small for that. But if there was to be a sponsor, it would be the Line of Beauty, which I promise is actually super integral to Jim Lee's work. Overall, both hair, bodies, everything. And in every single comic book you own, I guarantee it. In case you don't know what Line of Beauty is, it's an S curve with a bigger curve and a smaller curve, and they basically create a lovely dynamic whip shape that can be used all over. Now, think of this whip shape in a 3D form, just like a ribbon. You can create these ribbons by emphasising the curves with a duplicate curve at the widest point, creating the illusion of 3D form. These ribbons are then used on a lot of characters, both on the front scalp to give dangling curves, and to create the larger, more dynamic hair shapes as a whole. One top tip I have is to always consider the motion of the character when it comes to your hair. Those pesky lines of beauty are back again. Longer haired characters such as Jean and Psylocke can be spotted with long lines of beauty throughout their hair. In this case, they are used to give dynamic shape in hair that ordinarily, in our world, would be pulled down by gravity. Keep an eye out the next time you read a comic book, and once you've seen them, you can't not see them. Back to our shape chart. Looking at Rogue and Magneto's curly hair, we can see both the shape and the form itself are full of these lines of beauty. And one thing that we can also see though, it looks very organic and slightly chaotic. So how do we go about deciphering this chaotic and organic feel? Well, we need to stick to rule number 1 of today, which is don't be too repetitive. The most logical solution I have to drawing the general shape of curly hair is this: to imagine from the root of the hair to the end of the tip as one long line of beauty. However, it has the middle chopped out and the newfound edges that we've created tapered with line weighting. Another way that Jim avoids repetition with curly hair is that he will also draw curls in one direction for a short period and then change the direction in which it's curling, or rotate the curl from the root. This helps keep the form more organic while still following Rule 1. Rogue uses everything that we've learned so far. She has volume, she has layers, she has lines of beauty, she has overlaps and underlaps, and more that I probably haven't deciphered quite yet. The best advice I have is to be comfortable stacking these layers on top of one another and to follow Rule 1, not to be repetitive with your lines, or your forms, or your shapes. Now that we understand hair as a whole, we understand the shape, the form, layers, volume, etc. Let's talk about the actual penciling of it. Now, don't be afraid to use line breaks on the outer shape, as the full hair form rarely is fully outlined, especially when it comes to longer hair. Embrace having gaps and using your line weight and rendering to tell the hair instead. This is especially true in smaller panels, where the hair is simplified using smaller, broken lines of beauty that don't create a fully shaped form and very little to no rendering. Now, I bet you thought when you saw I was going to be talking about Jim Lee and hair, you didn't think I'd be talking about Xavier and other people with no hair. Well, you'd be wrong. Which leads me to the question, what do you do when there is no hair? Jim, as we've learned so far throughout this series, leaves no detail untouched. He creates shiny highlight spots using render lines that go across the shape of the head. Or, in the case of Iceman, across the hairline? Step 2. Rendering. Rendering hair in general can be very complex or very simple depending on how you want to do it. Thankfully, in Jim's X-Men days, there is a relatively simple formula that we can use, following 3 simple rules. Rule 1, that we already know, is don't be too repetitive. Rule 2 is always know where your light source is. And Rule 3 is always consider the overall shape and form of the hair. We might ordinarily think of hair as strands, and I'd certainly be guilty of drawing these individual strands in my own work in the past. However, if we study Jim's hair, we can see that he groups hair strands together in rendered clumps. Let's do this for ourselves. So let's take our hair strand, multiply it a few times with the hair going in relatively the same direction. Now the main key to rendering hair, as with a lot of comic art, is Rule 1, to never be too repetitive. Let's create another clump next to it, but we'll change how many strands of hair we draw to alter the overall rendered shape. These incremental changes are what will make our hair look A, better, B, more like Jim Lee's, and C, a whole lot more natural. Now, you might be asking yourself, and me, how do I know where to draw these clumps of hair? Well, it's very simple. Rule number 2, know your light source. If we think of these rendered clumps of hair as shadows, the closer to the light source we go, the less rendered clumps there will be. Now, don't be afraid to draw big, dark clumps of hair if, for example, the light source is directly in front of your characters and we are viewing from behind, such as these examples. Just remember Rule 1, to break up that big black shape with a couple of strands of no rendering here or there to make it not look as boring or repetitive. The second question you might have is, what direction do I draw these hair clumps in? Well, if you remember rule number 3, consider hair shape and hair form when rendering. If we go back to our original shape chart, we can see that each character's rendering goes in the direction of the shape and the forms that we now know and understand. When it came to studying rendering, there was a few big surprises for me, so let's get into those. Sometimes Jim will make an active choice to not render a character's hair, either just in that scene or at all. For example, characters with white hair is rarely ever rendered at all. If we look at Rogue, you can see that he rarely renders the white part of her hair and only renders the red forms instead. And this is the same for Magneto and his white hair. It is very rarely rendered. My take on this is that he's trying to adhere to rule number 1, try not to be too repetitive. If all the characters in the scene have rendered hair, it sort of all looks a bit samey. And if everybody's hair is rendered, that's a lot of rendering. That's a lot for the viewer to look at. As well as, if you have characters that have the same hair colour, such as Jean and Rogue, there are going to be less differences between them both at a glance. So, that's my take. It might not be the reason why, but it's a theory. Step 3. Body hair. Today's lucky number is 7. We're going to be drawing lots of backwards, slightly curvy 7s for body hair, utilising the same rules that we learned in our faces video regarding facial hair. Firstly, Jim draws these curvy 7s in the direction of hair growth, and in terms of the form of the hair, the area with the brightest light equals less hairs, and in the shadowy areas, these number 7s become more dense and clumped together. Don't forget that hairs aren't flat to the skin and have their own volume and can be drawn with height pointing away from the body. As for fully grown beards and chops, there's very few in issue 1, so I don't have too much to add about that because all of the same principles that we've learned throughout this video can be applied. And that's it, we've got to the end of video 3. If you've got to the end of the video, I really super appreciate you watching. If you have any feedback for me or any suggestions, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. I've had an overwhelming response to these videos and I just really appreciate it. It's warmed my heart to see that other people care as much about these analysis videos as I do, so I just wanted to take the time to say thank you from me and from Batman, of course. So until next time, where I'll be talking about rendering, it's going to be a big video, it's going to be heavy, it's going to be great, I hope. Keep on sketching, and I'll see you around.